Hi, this is Andrew Abrams from Recur360, and for this demo, I'm going to go over how to create recurring invoices for new transactions that you're going to generate from our system. One of the purposes of Recur360 is to replace the memorized transactions in QuickBooks Desktop or the recurring transactions within QuickBooks Online. The reasons that you would want to use our service for that is that in QuickBooks Desktop, memorized transactions don't automatically email out, nor do they automatically process customer payments via ACH. And if you want to process an automatic payment via credit card, you have to set up two transactions, one in the Intuit Payments module for the credit card, and then your recurring invoice for the invoice itself. And then you need to apply them on the back end. With QuickBooks Online, if you're going to have a recurring transaction with a payment associated with it, you have to set it up as a sales receipt. Or if it's going to email out with a balance due, you have to set it up as an invoice. So depending on how you're going to get paid, whether you're in QuickBooks Desktop or Online, in those programs, you have to set up the transaction differently based on that payment or lack of payment. So in Recur360, we simplify that. You create all of your recurring invoices within one dashboard. And on each invoice, you can choose whether you have a payment already on file and you want to automatically charge the transaction against that payment on file, or because our system allows you to have your customers pay online, it can just email out the invoice with the balance due and they can click on the pay online link. So I'm going to show both of those ways of creating a recurring invoice, both with the stored payment information and with one where they will pay online. So first of all, I'm going to go into my recurring invoices module, and I'm going to click in the upper right-hand corner to add a new recurring invoice. Now, you can give it a template name and a description. These are just really more sortable identifiers within the database. So I'm going to name this admin fee, and I'm going to choose my customer. So I can click on it and scroll down, or I can type in a customer name and it will find it in the system. And the description of this will be a monthly admin fee. Again, you don't have to populate template name or description field. I'm just doing it as additional information. I'm then going to set the interval as monthly, and you can create your own intervals. So if you want to run it every month on the 1st of the month, you would do that. If you want to run it every 2 months on the 5th of the month, or the 2nd or whatever, you can set it to do that. You can have it set to run daily, every day. You could have it set to run weekly, every week on a Monday, or every 3 weeks on a Tuesday. And you could have it set to run annually every January 1st. So you can totally define what your intervals are. I'm going to go back to monthly. I want to run it every month on the 1st of the month. Now, if I had the payment information stored for the customer, I could check this box, but since I don't have it there, I can't at the moment. And so I'll move on to the next section is, when do I want this to start? Do I want this to start on November 1st? If so, the next recur date will be on November 1st. And it will run on the 1st day of every month indefinitely. Or I can set it to run after 5 occurrences. So it'll end March of 2018. Or I could have it end by a specific date. So I could have it run once and run again December 1st, and therefore it'll just run 2 instances. So I'm going to tell it to run indefinitely, and that I want to automatically send the invoice and payment emails to the customer, as well as send an overdue notice. And now my overdue notice is driven by the terms. So for this customer, their terms are net 15. But if I don't want them to get an invoice the day after net 15, I can tell it to delay that to 5 days after the due date. So if this invoice was created on November 1, net terms of 15 means that it's due on the 16th, but I don't want to send them a reminder email until the 21st, just to give them an extra grace period. This is something that QuickBooks Desktop and Online don't offer because your terms are your terms. So we allow you to set a delay on when the overdue notice will go out. And the purpose of that is if you give them net 15 and they send a check on the 15th day and you get it a couple days later, you're giving them that grace period. If you want to mark the invoices to be printed when it hits QuickBooks, you can go ahead and check that box, and that just allows you to print and mail out of QuickBooks. If you're never going to print it, you don't need to check that. The terms come over from the customer account. You can define your class, and you can reset the rep on the transaction if it's not the default. Go ahead and add new items. It's very similar to QuickBooks, except instead of it being a drop-down, you'll choose to add a new item. You'll grab the item that you're going to use. I'm going to grab admin fee. I'm going to choose my class again. If I want it to be different, I can make it different. Otherwise, I'll just set it the same. You can set your quantity and your rate for every single line item on each transaction. So I'm going to say this is $100, and we're going to call this a monthly admin fee. And if it's taxable, you can set it to taxable or not. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And so now here's the transaction that'll be generated. And if you want to put a customer memo in here, you can go ahead and do this. This will show up on the invoice. Okay. So if I go ahead and save this, it's now going to queue this to run on November 1st. But let's say you want to enter something in and backdate it so it runs right away. Well, then you could edit that transaction and say, you know what, let's backdate this and have it run dated October 1st. Okay. So what's going to happen is at the next interval, it's going to process this invoice and backdate it to October 1st. And then it'll run as many times it needs to today to play catch up. So I'm going to go ahead and save this now, and it's going to requeue it that it's going to run twice on November 1st, once for the October 1st, and then once again on November 1st. But I don't have to wait for that to happen. Our transactions process at 1 a.m. every morning. So if I want this to process now, I can go ahead and say push transactions. And by doing that, it's going to process the October invoice today, and then queue it to process the November 1 invoice tomorrow. So what did push transactions do exactly? Well, it created an invoice, it emailed it to the customer, and it has queued it to sync it to QuickBooks. Now, if my QuickBooks Web Connector is running in the background, then it will automatically run at the next interval, which by most configurations is every 30 minutes. So I can just let that run, and at the next sync interval, it'll bring it in. But if I want to bring this into QuickBooks right away for whatever reason, I can always do a manual sync and tell it to update selected. And by doing so, the Web Connector will read the upcoming tasks in QuickBooks, or excuse me, in Recur360, and then it'll download that transaction or transactions into QuickBooks Desktop. So we are currently syncing with QuickBooks Desktop and downloading that transaction, that process, and then syncing back any changes to any open invoices so that Recur360 is updated with open balance. So if I click on all invoices and I choose this month, then we'll now see that that $100 invoice has been imported into QuickBooks Desktop. When it imported, QuickBooks automatically assigned it an invoice number, and in the memo field, we've recorded the Recur360 ID. So if we look at this, the Recur360 ID started with a 5181, and in QuickBooks, that's exactly that transaction. And it goes into QuickBooks just as if you had created it in QuickBooks directly. So it's that same familiar look and feel, and in the memo field is our reference number. If I go ahead and go back to Recur360 and click on my sync status, I'll see that there are no upcoming tasks currently and that what happened has been logged, okay? But now I have an invoice with a balance due. So, well, first of all, let me go to my email and I'll show you what the invoice that your customer gets. They get an Uber-style email with also a PDF attached to it. And the PDF is the standard QuickBooks template with your name and information on it, the customer's billed to and shipped to, the items and rates that you're charging them for. And then up here would be your logo if you chose to upload that. We have very limited customization in our templates because they're just meant to be very simple so that you can send the customer an invoice and get paid. Your customer could then print this invoice and mail you a payment. Or they can click on the click here to pay your invoices link directly in their email. Now in Recur360, if I go ahead and look at my reporting and I go to my invoice history, I see that this customer has an invoice with an open balance due and no payment has been applied to it. So if the customer mails me a check, I could go ahead and process payment and say that they're paying via check. Okay. And then it'll record the QuickBooks invoice number on that check so that when it posts to QuickBooks, it'll correlate the two. Or if I know their payment information, I can store it in the system and I can choose that they're going to pay via Visa. But if the customer chooses to pay on their own, then it'll get recorded in the system as well. So I'm going to go ahead and act as if I'm the customer, and I'm going to click to pay my invoices online. Now this is going to bring in the invoice that I just processed, but it's also going to show any open invoices as well. So I'm going to go ahead and choose which invoices as the customer I want to pay. So let's go ahead and say I want to pay that invoice. So we're going to pay that one invoice for $100, and I'm going to go ahead and enter in my information. So after entering that, the customer has the choice to store and allow your payment details to be automatically used for future transactions. If they check that, then their payment information will be stored into their account and all recurring transactions will automatically use that. If they uncheck that, it just means that every invoice you send them will have a pay online link and they'll choose to approve it if they want to pay for it based on approval versus automatically. So in this case, I'm going to say, go ahead and automatically store it. And as a security measure, they will have to choose that they're not a robot. And then go ahead and click submit. And go ahead and pay for that one invoice. So what's happening now is the payment was processed. It was applied to that invoice and removed from the open payments or open invoices tab of our payment portal. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. And so now that customer would have received another Uber-like email, but it shows that their invoice is now paid. And if they open up the PDF, it reflects that as well. And in Recur360, if we go back to our reports and look at our invoice history, I now see that there's no payment or no balance due on that invoice, excuse me, and it recorded the payment ID. And then it also queued that to sync the payment into QuickBooks so that the next time the QuickBooks connector runs, and I'll go ahead and do a manual update instead of waiting 30 minutes, that it's going to go ahead and download that payment into QuickBooks. Now, the original invoice day was October 1. And so now we're going to wait for the received payment to come in for that $100 against that invoice. And again, the Recur360 ID will show up on the payment in the memo field, and then also automatically apply it to the invoice. So now I'll see that that payment came in against that Recur360 ID. So Recur360 ID 5181. So if I go to the customer and I go to OTB-01 and pull up their account, I will see the received payments in there. Okay. And then if I update my sync status, it's no longer has any current transactions. Now, if I go into my customer record and pull up that customer, I can look at their transaction history. And if I click on an invoice, it will pull up transactionally what was processed, and also a log of all the emails sent out. So the invoice paid email went out, the invoice due email went out, and then it queued the late notice, but it'll cancel now that it's paid in full. So that's an example of how to set up a recurring invoice, how to backdate it or future date it so that it'll process immediately or when that date hits, automatically email the customer, how the customer would pay online to pay their invoice, and then how that shows in Recur360 from a customer basis, from our invoice history report, and from our payment history report. And also we have a report on all the emails that went out of the system in one, so it tracks that as well. On my next demo, I'll be showing how to process recurring payments, as well as schedule collection emails based on open invoices, whether they were created in QuickBooks Desktop or online directly, or in Recur360, or imported through a shopping cart into your version of QuickBooks and then brought up into Recur360 to manage. So thank you again for your time and have a great day.